Welcome to the Saturday Salon at Centaur, our online conversation series. I want to acknowledge the privilege it is to live and work on the island of Montreal, which is considered the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation and has been a point of creativity and exchange for millennia for many of the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. I also want to thank Canada Life for sponsoring our artistic diversity discussion at Centaur, which is part of our Saturday Salon series. This week, I am thrilled to welcome Émilie Monnet and Jessica Carmichael, who were slated to be part of the 2021 season at Centaur. At least that was the plan before the pandemic. Hi, Émilie. Hey, Jessica.
Hi.
How are you? Thank you so much for joining me today. Émilie was going to present her enigmatic production inspired by her Anishinaabe heritage called Okinawa as part of our Brave New Looks offering in collaboration with Imago Theatre. Émilie is a multidisciplinary artist whose work questions the modern world. She founded Onishka Productions in 2011 to create work from a variety of cultures and disciplines. In 2016, she founded Indigenous Contemporary Scene to focus on Indigenous art creation and presented the results in Edinburgh in 2019, featuring Indigenous artists from across Turtle Island. And Jessica is an actor, director, and dramaturg of mixed Abenaki and European heritage. She's an assistant professor at Theatre of Concordia. I did this earlier. Assistant professor of theatre at Concordia, and was about to make her Stratford Festival directorial debut with Thompson Highway's wonderful play, The Rez Sisters, featuring an entirely Indigenous cast and crew. She's also developing a new theatre piece inspired by her Indigenous heritage. The working title Comes by Flying, Spirituality Abenaki Project. And I had invited Jessica to actually direct the Pulitzer Prize winning play The Flick by the American playwright Annie Baker as part of our Essential series in 2021. So all of that's out of the way. It's great to have you here. I wish it was in the context of your shows, but that will come, I promise. So I want to start with talking about you both have a very mixed background from Indigenous and non-Indigenous heritage, and that means you also have a mixed relationship with many different languages. So Émilie, can you when we talked earlier, you talked about the importance of recognizing the diversity of Indigenous experience. So can you talk about your own sort of background? Where'd you grow up?
Yes, hi. Nin Émilie Ndinchtaka. So my name is Émilie, and I was born in Ottawa, and I grew up in between Gatineau and Brittany in France because my dad is from there. My mom is a member of Kitigan-Ziipi, and so I've been growing between those two territories, and mostly in French, although my mother is more Anglophone. And and in Montreal, Mouniang or Jojage since 2007, I think.
Wow. So it's and so each place has its own identity and its own, even its own language or multiple languages that live in that place.
Yes, and that territory just outside of Ottawa on the Quebec side. I mean, it's very much bilingual in French and English, and it's unceded Algonquin territory, and the Anishinaabe it's the language from the land over there. So yes, and that's what I explore in Okinawa, but I guess we'll talk more about that.
Oh yeah, we will for sure. Jessica, you grew up out west, right?
Yeah, I grew up in a mix of in Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territory. And I grew up, I think I was saying before when we were meeting that it's a mixed kind of experience for me growing up with my father, who worked in the Indigenous inner city for a lot of my young life into my teen years. When he was working for the Boyle Street Co-op and single men's hostels. And so we were more exposed to the Plains Cree and the Blackfoot Saulteaux communities, the Dene, and not my own at all, due to some very intense kind of internal racism within my own family. I mean, obviously we know more and more as we're talking about these conversations about how things are broken in family lines due to wanting to survive. I think that's a big part of my family story. But regardless, my father especially sought out, a work with the Indigenous community. That was his life. And we had, you know, a young girl living with us who was Cree when I was growing up that he wanted to adopt, and that didn't work out. But it's sort of always been, you know, my life has been kind of a mix of knowing and not knowing, until more recently when we had a significant family member pass away about 20 some odd years ago, my grandmother, and more stories started to come out. And that was while I was living here in Montreal, closer to my heritage. So I can talk more about that, but sort of, I didn't have my language growing up. I didn't have a way of accessing you know, our heritage until things sort of blew up and more conversations started happening nationwide, I guess, where I felt that I could start exploring my heritage more openly.
That's so interesting, and it has. I think it's we're all fairly aware of the fact that part of the belief, what we learned from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was that language was part of the way to eliminate Indigenous culture, to take away language. So you both are artists who've gone back and reclaimed your language in a sense. What inspired that? Émilie, did you grow up speaking Anishinaabe or Anishinaabe-Moan, or how did
No,
how did
I
you?
didn't. Well, I grew up with words here and there, but I really started really delving in the language. It was about 7 years ago, I would say. We started like a language nest here in Montreal, and we're all different women, not all artists, but all Anishinaabe, Algonquin, but all from different communities.
Mhm.
And it was Veronique Tusky, so she's from Barrier Lake, and she was teaching us. We would meet at, you know, like my place or somebody else's place around a kitchen table, having tea and learning like that. And it was really special for that, like creating a community of women learning the language. Then after that, I think it's really with my art too that I'm able to make more progress in the language, because I work one-on-one with an Anishinaabe language keeper. It's still Veronique, and right now I've started a language class online. It's more from around the Manitoulin area, but also since 2 weeks ago, I started with Native Montreal. They offer classes, free classes.
Wow.
Yeah, in all the languages, Indigenous languages of Quebec. It's pretty amazing. So
Oh, I didn't know that. That's so cool.
I think they even have Abenaki as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
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 And so, Jessica, you have, I know from talking to you about some of the work you're doing, you've started to study, because your actual, even though you grew up in the West, your heritage is Ondanak, right?
It's Abenaki. It's connected to the people in Odanak and also down in what is known as New England. Those borders aren't, you know, recognized normally for nomadic people. And yeah, the Abenaki is an endangered Algonquin language as well of Quebec and the northern states of New England. And so I didn't grow up with it, but similar to Émilie, I've sort of, I mean, it's interesting through art. I think that's more where, especially when I was wanting to connect through my Indigenous heritage, I was especially buoyed when I worked at Native Earth Performing Arts in Toronto, and the artists there just really helping me engage in my heritage. And again, I was more exposed to Anishinaabe and different languages, not my own. And finally, when I was able to accept a tenure track position here, which I was hoping to get closer to Montreal, that's when I started to more actively visit the reserve and start seeking out language lessons, especially because my great-great-great-great-grandfather created a printing press in Odanak, and a lot of his books are preserved there. And so through a lot of the research and reclaiming of our family history, I've been able to engage with his actual preservation of language,
Wow.
Especially through Middlebury, Vermont's Abenaki school that they just piloted this summer. So I'm just trying to find as many ways as I can to learn the language. And there's a lot of elders down south, especially, who are actively working to make that happen.
That's so exciting. That's fascinating. I know you've taught me a few words, and I have to learn them again because I don't.
I'm relearning myself.
Yeah. So with this idea of, you've both mentioned that language, your connection to your Indigenous languages. I mean, as we say, Montreal is a city of multiple languages, but you've both talked about the fact that your art, your work as an artist has led you to a deeper understanding and desire to connect to your language. So I'd like to talk for a moment with you, Émilie, about Okinawa, which was the piece we were going to be presenting. It would have been on pretty much right now, I think, at Centaur. And tell me, where does that piece come from? We have a few images from it, I think. So talk a little bit about Okinawa.
Yeah, well, it really comes, the starting point is really a dream that I had, a recurrent dream that I had of a giant beaver the size of a bear that comes to me and puts a little bag in my hand, and then it speaks about what it puts into my hand, and then I wake up, and every time I would do that dream, I would see a beavers and beaver dams the following day. So I had that dream 3 times, and it was like so important, felt so important. So the piece was about to decipher what that dream is about. And then it was a way to bridge into just the lineage of women in my family, and looking how about transmission and the things that get broken on the way and what still gets transmitted, and as a way to reflect on that. And Okinawa means dam or beaver dam, so it's really a reflection on the inner dams that we have, and what is the journey to take off these pieces of wood in the end to make that water of memory flow again. So I was weaving in my own personal story, and I had been diagnosed with cancer at the time, and it was in my throat. So then the dam became a metaphor about my own voice, and then I was linking it to beaver medicine and dreams, basically.
Oh, that's amazing. The water of memory, letting the water of memory flow, is such a beautiful concept for a piece of art. I think it's extraordinary. Can we go back again? I think Vanessa in the background has a picture of your great grandmother. Is that right?
Yeah, her name was, so that's 4 generations away from me. And her name was Mani Pizandawach. So she really inspired the piece. I am lucky to still dream of her. So those two are interwoven into the piece. And it's really about my connection to dreams and ancestors and to beavers. It's really a lot about beavers.
But that's so great, because it's such on a kind of basic level, Canada as a country is built on the pelt of a beaver in many respects.
Yeah, totally. And for me, there was a very strong analogy or a metaphor about colonization, and how the extermination of Indigenous people was also very much similar and linked to the extermination of beavers too. They almost disappeared at the beginning of the 19th century. So, and the commodification of beavers and Indigenous women as well. So I was really looking into those relationships or parallels.
That's amazing. So Jessica, you got to see this piece. You said, we were talking earlier, and you went with your daughter. What's it like to, as an Indigenous artist, to experience other Indigenous work? How does that work for you?
I mean, it's super exciting, and it's inspiring, obviously, especially in the conversations with my daughter. I think it's really important to expose her to many different sorts of Indigenous heritage. She's been very lucky. She comes to rehearsal. She's been on the reserve when I've been working on different projects as well. And so I think it was exciting when we went and saw Emily's piece. It was the first piece we'd seen since we'd moved to Montreal of an Indigenous artist. And so that was really important for her. It's just funny, we were actually just talking today in preparation for this about that piece, and her saying, yeah, we felt like we were inside water. And she was saying, as we know, because we're in these times, she said, I really miss going to the theater, and I miss sharing stories and hearing stories. And I think that's also what's so important for us as we look at our Indigenous heritage and see artists like Émilie is reclaiming story, or showing how storytelling is so integral to our livelihoods and our spirits. And especially what she's talking about in terms of the dream world as well, like how that weaves into what we create. Half of our lives we're sleeping anyway, so maybe, and we're not, we're awake, receiving messages. And I think that's I loved being able to talk about that with her, and that's what I think what was so beautiful about Emilie's piece as well.
Well, we have actually a picture of you and your daughter at the grave of your great grand. What is this picture? Let's.
Wait. So this is Pierre Paul Wazulkian. He goes by many names. So this is my great grandma. Like Émilie, I have 4 generations ago. That's her grave site there, Sarah Sunkaran. She's actually, you can see that her name has been she's assimilated so deeply into Canada that she even changed the spelling of Sarah. It's very different on the on the Canadian census when she was 5. But the one with my daughter is on the reserve in Odanak. They have the church that my great grandfather built. And Sarah was married there to Donald B. Carmichael, my great grandfather. And he built that church, around 1838, I want to say he founded the church. And he had 60 faithful there, including 45 Indigenous people. There was a Catholic church at the time there as well, and the priests who opposed to his mission because he had been studying at the St. Francis Indian Reserve. And he wanted to create the Anglican Church as a way to preserve the Abenaki culture and the Abenaki language. And so he translated a lot of sermons into Abenaki and held ceremonies there. And so that's a commemoration on Odanak to him, as well as there's a few other plaques. And they were recently vandalized, unfortunately. But that's where I met, my daughter and I met the secretary of the church, and they brought us in, and we sat with them in their homes and shared with us some of the books that they have preserved of him. And it's just really special being there. And that was the first time I was able to take her there. In that photograph. That was quite a few years ago.
Yeah. That's really cool. I love the way family heritage lineage, we think about these things in relation to like European plays. It's always, Shakespeare is full of lineage and histories, and stories of families, but we think of it in Indigenous, we often sort of think Indigenous theater is separate because of its connection to heritage, but in fact that is all connected in theater in general, in stories in general, and the way we keep our histories alive. As artists, do you feel like your Indigenous background, I mean, how does besides the actual stories, the connection to story, but how does the storytelling get affected by the Indigenous heritage that you have? Like, do you feel like you approach storytelling from a different angle, or is it simply storytelling? Is it always just storytelling, whether you are coming from an Indigenous perspective or a European perspective?
I think I don't think okay, which part of my brain or my creativity am I using? Is it my French side or my Anishinaabe side? I mean, they're so intertwined, and it's so connected that it's just what I bring into the creation space that I'm in. So I think for me, it's more thinking of processes of making work, how it can be as much as possible infused with values, Anishinaabe values. There's the 7 grandfathers and grandmothers teachings that I like to refer to, but what it means to infuse that and to embody that in creation processes, and in how you create a team or a circle of people, collaborators working on the piece, how you hold space for conversations that emerge from the work that you're doing. So it's more about thinking in terms of that, and thinking too about the land that we're also creating work on, because I think that also has a influence into the work. Maybe it's less, it's more invisible maybe, but it is quite concrete, quite, because it's the land, but at the same time, it's the land, how it's also populated with forces and spirits and ancestors. And so I think it's about more activating those relationships and bringing that into the work. So I guess that's how I would say. And then, for example, with that dream of the giant beaver, so I started talking to some elders or knowledge keepers about my dream, because I wanted to kind of understand what it was. And that's actually how I found out that giant beavers actually really existed one time, long time ago, at the time of dinosaurs. But there's stories about them. And so it really felt like a gift to access this kind of information that I don't know. Well, maybe I would have accessed it later, but I accessed it through my dream, basically. So it's really bringing that too at the source of what creation is all about.
Wow, that's amazing. And beaver, you mentioned beaver medicine. Can you just explain that just a little bit? What does that mean?
Oh, well, I guess maybe come and see the show, because the show is all about finding out what it is, because that's what the beaver gives me and speaks to me. So I'm trying to understand what those words are about. So it can be it's different things. It's for the cancer. It's for family healing. It's for my connection to my identity. There's so many different layers to it.
Great. Well, I'm going to get that play on stage, I promise you. And for you, Jessica, I had actually invited you into Centaur to direct not an Indigenous play, because we had had so many conversations over the years. We've known each other for a little while now. And we were talking about the theater that's essential, that's going to talk to the moment. And we had landed on Annie Baker as a writer and the play, The Flick. But you had an Indigenous position. Like, is there an Indigenous approach to a European or a North American play, or is that a silly question? And you can say it's a silly question.
No, I was thinking about Emily Six. I think that the process is a huge part of it, like bringing in I think I'm really interested in trying to understand what is an Indigenous sensibility, but also in tension with Western training, or like, what are the questions we're asking, especially as we want to encounter, embodied performance methods, or, how do we bring that into like Indigenous ways of knowing into the work? I think it's interesting just about The Flick, because I think originally our discussions were around, potentially finding a new Indigenous work for me to direct. And originally we centered our thoughtful conversation around the Lakota playwright Larissa Fasthorse, who's based in Santa Monica. And then ultimately, we thought about doing a new Indigenous play more locally, but then realizing we need more playwright development time for that. And so we recircled around some of my Western training, or discussion around some plays that I've been teaching at Concordia in my playwriting class even, and that work in different forms. And we compiled like a list of diverse artists. Susan Laurie Parks was on that list, Ryan Jacob Jenkins, Tara Bagan, who, if people don't know, she's a finalist for the Simonovich Prize right now, Sarah Rule, Lynn Nottage, Adrian Kennedy, Amanda Paris, Carol Churchill, and then of course Annie Baker. And I think what was interesting about when we got to Baker was, and what I think sort of what I was interested in terms of thinking about Indigenous or Indigenous knowledge, or teachings or conversations I've had, was around Baker's ability to capture silence and what happens in silence, and like our behaviors and our evolutions, stagnation, when we can and we can't communicate things. And I think that for me was sort of interesting, talking with you about exploring Indigenous conversations of ways of working, coming, to this idea of what happens in silence, what's happened historically, oppressively, and what does that mean regarding even space to like the relationship to land, which, like Emily was saying, is a very large conversation. It's not always so tangible, although it is, but what it also means to culture, to language. And so I think we found ourselves compelled, you and Aida, in that conversation about Baker talking about crazy stuff happens during silences in the theater. I think she says that. And we were interested in like, what does that mean? And let's investigate that. And then what does that mean in terms of you being responsible as an Indigenous, like someone in the community who's trying to kind of look at your roots in Western realism training, and then vice versa. And like, well, how are you accountable in the rehearsal hall? Like, what does that mean? And I think that was really interesting to me in terms of trying to think about, how do we look at Baker with these questions, but also allow, like Emily's saying, a process to happen about orature and performance methods and these conversations around silence, and how does that live in a play like Baker's. Sorry, I'm talking long, but so I think
I think
that's where it came from, which was really invigorating, because it sort of got back to inclusivity for us as well, about like, what does that finally mean in how we question authenticity and lived experience. And I think that's something that's, for me, integral in terms of, or what's so special and rich about working with Indigenous communities, is having those types of conversations.
Well, and I love the idea that we bring Indigenous experience to Western culture, not just Western culture to Indigenous experience, that it actually can go both ways, that the inclusivity is a multi-dimensional act. And in that regard, I think we have about 5 minutes sort of left. And so I just wanted to kind of finish this off with just looking at this one question, which is, in this moment of social reckoning with our collective colonial past, what do you think the role of theater is in furthering the progress toward a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive theater, and by extension, the society? So I know it's like a massive sort of question, but what do you think theater can do to help us as a community, as a theater community, become more reflective of who we are and where we are? Emily, do you want to go? Do you want to give it a go?
Well, I think we've seen it, with when theaters started to open again in September. There was like full right away, like people are craving these moments of communion, I would say, to receive the words and the bodies, the presence of people offering. It's like I really, the shows, I was part in one show, and it just really recenters how important these experience of being in presence with others and in that sharing is so important. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of amplifying more of those voices. Like there's so many more voices, and there should be more spaces in the theaters to hear those voices. So I'm thankful to you, Etta, to be programming a few Indigenous artists in your season, but I think there needs to be more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Jessica, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Emily's saying. And I think, I agree, like we've been having these important conversations around, quite frankly, how things have not been equitable, and that there's this lack in meaningful inclusion over the years. We know that. And trying to figure out, indeed, like what do those words really mean, person to person, and it's not just identified by an institution. Like what do they mean, and how do we address systemic change? And I think holding space for those types of conversations is, for me, theater's responsibility. If we're truly interested in a profession that has anything to do with social change, and for me, I feel like, personally, theater we always talk about, it has a potential to transform. We're transformed by theater, and we talk about that in many artistic circles. And so what does that mean in terms of our social interactions and our ability to transform culture, maybe, or society, like create societal institutional change and impact society in fundamental ways? And I agree with Emily, we need to do more, and tell stories where we're kind of confronted with inequity as well as equity, and engage in those kind of like an alternative society, maybe not with solutions, just more questions of how do we become more empathetic.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really brilliant what you've both said, which is the essential thing for us who are in these positions of putting things on stage is to hold space, to make space and to hold space. And I think that it is so exciting to know that as soon as we can open our doors, I'm going to be calling both of you because I'm holding space for both of you and for many others as well, to open up our conversation with what theater can be and who it can talk about and how it can talk. So this has been it's just great to have the chance to sit down with both of you. And now I just want to, like, it's so weird not to just go, okay, let's go have a cup of tea and really go back to, get further into it as we
walk around old Montreal together.
Oh yes. Oh please. So it's coming. It's definitely coming. Yes. And Emily, your next piece is actually officially coming in April. Do you want to just to finalize that, you want to tell us a little bit about that?
So this is my new creation piece. It's inspired by the life and the trial of Marguerite Duplessis, who was the first Indigenous person in Canada and also the first slave in Canada to have a court case to ask for her freedom. So she's an important figure, and I'm making parallels with between the past and right now, but also linking those stories of resistance of Indigenous women and Black women that were shipped to the Caribbean. Yeah.
Oh, wonder! It's a completely, again, a world I know nothing about, and I'm excited to see it when it comes out, because I think the world is so big, and theater has the capacity to open a window on it all the time. So thank you both. I think we're at our little time. Our next salon, just to kind of wrap it all up, our next salon is on November 28th, and we're going to be welcoming Laurence Dauphiné and Antoine Yared, because they have been working on another piece which was supposed to be part of this season, but they're still working anyway, called Cyclorama. So we'll be talking about that, that looks at the history, the two-language history of theater in Montreal. So yeah, it's really fun. I can't wait to show it to everybody. So I thank you for joining us today. I was so excited by the prospect of having both of you in our season, and I really do look forward to welcoming you both back. When we have a moment, we can open the doors and bring the audience in and tell stories together. It'll be just wonderful. I also want to thank our Saturday Salon online team, Vanessa Rigaud and Eloi Savoie, for making this all possible. And thank you all for spending a little bit of your Saturday with us. I'm so wishing that there was a whole great season planned. There will be one again when we figure out how to get enough vaccines around and cute enough masks that everybody's comfortable wearing them all the time. So here's to joining us all together in the theater in the future. Have a happy Saturday. Stay safe.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.